Hey, this is Jason with WPGraphQL, and today I want to walk through how to build your first WPGraphQL extension plugin. So in this video, we're going to build a plugin that extends WPGraphQL by registering a custom field. This video will serve as a foundation for future videos in which we build custom functionality to extend WPGraphQL. So thanks again for joining me, and let's dive right in. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is open up our WordPress project in an IDE. And I have a WordPress install open here in PHP Storm. You can use whatever IDE of your choosing. And WordPress plugins live in WP Content Plugins directory. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new plugin within this directory. So I'm going to click New Directory, and for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to call this WPGraphQL Extension. You can call this whatever you want. And then within this directory, I'm going to create a new file. And so I'm going to call this WPGraphQL Extension.php. And so it's best practice. It's not mandatory, but it is best practice in it's best practice in WordPress to name your plugin file the same as the plugin directory name. And so our plugin directory is WPGraphQL Extension. Our plugin file is going to be the same name, .php. And so to get started with a WordPress plugin, all you need to do is give it an opening PHP tag, and then we do a doc block. So we do / and then 2 stars or asterisks, and then we say plugin name, and you can give it a name. It's also best practice to have your plugin name follow the same naming as your directory. So in this case, we'll say WPGraphQL Extension. And now, this is all we actually need to do to create a WordPress plugin. So I'm going to hop over to local, which is where this is running. I'm going to open my admin, and we are going to take a look at our plugins. So if we come here to plugins, we now have WPGraphQL Extension. So all we had to do is write this little bit of code to get an actual plugin. So you can see it here. So we can add additional information. So we can say, what are some other information we might want to add? We can say plugin URI, and we could say, for example, https www.wpgraphql.com. And if we refresh our page in WordPress again, we'll see now a visit plugin site link. We can then add version, and in this case we'll just say 0.0.1 beta, and if we refresh again, we'll see the version shows up here. We can add an author, and we can say this one is going to be WPGraphQL, and if I refresh again, we'll see the author. If I provide an author URI, we'll put wpgraphql.com again, and if I refresh, we'll see that it's now linked. So some very, very, very cool stuff we can do here. We can say plugin, or it's just description, not plugin description. So we can say description, and we can say this is an example plugin for extending WPGraphQL. Okay. All right, and now we have our description. So now we can actually activate this plugin. It's not going to do anything because we haven't coded anything to be done yet. And we can also deactivate it. Activate, deactivate. Great, right? It doesn't matter. I'm actually going to change the name real quick to WPGraphQL Extension without a space. Just personal preference. So yeah, that's as much as you need to build a WordPress plugin. So now I want to show you how to customize the schema by registering a custom field to the GraphQL schema. And when I say custom field, I don't necessarily mean custom field as in like a meta field in WordPress. I just mean a new field to the GraphQL schema. So what I've done here, I've opened the graphical IDE that ships with WPGraphQL. You can open this up here in the top menu, graphical IDE, or over here under graphical IDE. And what I want to do here is explore the schema, and we're gonna just let's look at the root query. So we have all of these fields that exist, and we're going to add a new field just to see how this can work. So I'm going to search example, and we see no results are found. So our goal right now is to add a field called example. And so the first thing we are going to do is hook into an action called GraphQL register types. So we're going to say add action GraphQL register types, and we are going to say we'll give this a name like GraphQL extension register types. Okay, so we need to now create this function. So we're going to say function GraphQL extension register types, and now we can call this function register GraphQL field. And the way this function works, the first argument it takes is the name of the type in the GraphQL schema that you want to add a field to. And if we go back to our schema explorer, we can see at the very root of the graph we have two types. We have a root query type and a root mutation type. If we want to add a field called example at the root of our graph, we want to add it to this root query type. So I'm going to copy this name and take it over here and paste it. So the type name that we want to register a field to is root query. And now we have to give the field a name. So we're gonna give the name example. And then the third argument is going to be an array. And this is the configuration for the type of the field that is going to be returned. So the first thing we want to do is provide a description. And this is going to be a string. It's typically best practice to pass this through a internationalization function. So this will allow your strings to be translated. So I'm going to say this is just an example field. And if your plugin was set up for translations, you would have your text domain. So you can have this description. And then that's optional. You don't have to have a description, but it is best practice. And I'll show you in a second where that shows up. And then the next field is the type. So this is the type of data that your field will return when the user asks for it. So in our case, we are going to return a string. So we are going to declare that the example field on the root query type will return a string. And now if we save this and go back to our graphical, I'm going to refresh and it will load the schema again. And now I can search example, and we're going to see there's now a field called root query example. And I can click on this and it will show the description. This is just an example field. And that is the description that we typed here. So as we add fields and types to our schema, we can provide descriptions that are used in the built-in documentation for WPGraphQL. So this is super helpful. As you build things, you can describe it in your code, and the clients that are interacting with the API can read that as documentation. So the next thing that we need to do is provide a resolve function. And this is going to be a function that gets 4 arguments. The first argument we can call root or previous or object. I'll explain this in a little bit, but we're just going to call it root. And then the second argument it gets is args. The third argument is context. And the fourth argument is info. So when this field resolves, it gets these four things passed to it. So the root is the previous object that was resolved. Since we're adding a field to the root of our graph, nothing was previously resolved, so we're going to get nothing returned to us here. The second argument is input arguments, which the user can input into GraphQL, and we can use that input to affect how we resolve the field. We'll look at that in a second. Context is an object about the state of the GraphQL resolution. So some things in context would be like the current user that is executing their request and things like that. Info is an object that allows us to look into where in the GraphQL resolution tree we currently are. So we can see what the parent field is, what the child fields are, and then make decisions based on that. For our sake, we are not going to need this information right now, but I wanted to just highlight this for now. We will look at the arguments in just a second. So what I can do, since I promised that this field would return a string, I need to return a string. So I'm going to simply say hello as the string. So we are going to say, whenever the root query example field is called, execute this function. This function will return a string as we declared we would, and that string is going to have the value hello. So now I can come into my graphical IDE and I can type example. And when I execute this, we will get this string hello. So that's the very most basic way to register a field to the GraphQL schema. And so now I want to show you how to expand on this just a little bit more. So I mentioned this second argument is input arguments that the user can input into the GraphQL query, and we can use that to affect resolution. So what we're going to do here is define an argument on our field. And so the way we do this, we say args as a key on our field config, and this is going to accept an array, and that array is going to be an array of key and values as well. So the key is going to be the name of the input field. So we're simply going to call it test for now. We can call this whatever we want to call it. And the value of this field is going to be an array as well. And it's going to have the same things as registering the field. So it has a description, and this can be field to describe it. This description will show up in the schema documentation, so we can say your test input description, and we would set that up to be translated, so your text domain. And then we also need to define what type of data to allow to be input. So we can do string. We could also do integer or boolean or float or whatever other input types are available to the schema. And now we will have access to this argument. And so to see how this works, I'm going to concatenate our string and say args test. So what we're going to get passed here is an array of input from the user keyed by this key, right? So we're saying the user is allowed to input a field called test, and we are going to get that field and we are going to return it. And so now we're going to go back to our query, and when we execute this, we are going to be able to pass an argument into it. Hello again. And when I execute that, we get our string, and then we get the argument concatenated after it. And so we can now use this argument to do whatever we want. And so let me show you a debugging trick while we're here. There's two tricks that I use all the time when I'm doing GraphQL development. So the first one is WP send JSON, and I'll just define an array in here, and then we'll pass something like args. I'll say args. We'll say key is args, value is the variable. So what I can do here, this is almost like a breakpoint. And so what I can do here is execute WPGraphQL, and at that point in time, instead of continuing GraphQL resolution, it's going to stop right there and send me JSON. And so in this case, it's saying, here's the arguments that the user input. So I can change this to whatever I want, click execute, and we'll see that input being dumped. So this is a good debug tool. The other one, I'll comment that out, the other one is GraphQL debug. And same thing, we can pass an array to this, like so, and if I execute this, it would add it to our debug area here. Right now I have debug turned off, so I'm going to come into settings. I'm going to enable debug mode, which is right here. Save those settings, come back to graphical, click execute, and here we go. We have our debug message being output here. So this continued executing all of GraphQL. This time it just added some information. So this is our GraphQL debug message. So this is a good way of being able to check what information we have to work with at any point. And so like we could actually output the root just to see what's there, and it should be, I believe, just empty. So root is nothing. We could check what's available at context and info. That's probably for another video, but feel free to play with it on your own. So now we have this set up. We're not really doing much. We're allowing an argument to come in, and we're appending it to the string. So next, let's take a look at registering a field to another type. One of the most common types in the schema would be posts. And so we can query posts in a number of ways. One of the common ways is to query for a list of posts. I only have one post in this WordPress install, but let's say we wanted to give posts a color field, right? I want to be able to give posts a color and query that color in response. Right now, if I try to do this, I get this error. I cannot query this field. It doesn't exist. So let's make this exist. So inside this action, the GraphQL register types action, we can register another GraphQL field. So we can say register GraphQL field. And this time, we're going to say the type name is post. Our field name is color. And now we're going to configure it. And we are going to say description. We'll also get this set up for translations. We'll say the color field description. And we'll say your text domain. And now we're also going to give this the type of string. And we need a resolve function again. I'm just going to copy this to start. So this resolve function gets 4 arguments as well. Color value. I'm just going to return the string color value for now. And so let's give that a test. If I execute this now, it actually works. So what didn't work before now works. But this isn't super helpful. What we actually want to do is get the value of color, probably from meta, maybe something else, but most likely meta. Meta is a very common place to store things such as this. Might be a taxonomy term, who knows. So in order to get meta, the first thing I'm going to do real quick is we're going to save some meta to the post. So let me query the database ID just so we can see what the database ID is. The database ID is 1. So super quickly, I'm going to add action init, and we'll give that a function, and we are going to say update post meta ID 1, color as the meta key, and blue as the value. So what's going to happen is next time I load WordPress, it's going to store the value blue as the color of post 1. So all I have to do is refresh WordPress, and that will now be stored in my database. I'll comment that out, and what we can do now is we can say color equals get post meta ID 1, meta key is color, and true. So that means it's a true. This third argument means it's a single value, not an array. And what we are going to do is return color, and if color doesn't exist, we'll return a null value. So this allows us to adhere to the contract. We're going to return either a string or nothing. And so if I execute this now, we get blue. And if I change this again, we could change it, let's say, to red. And if I execute again, now it's red. So very cool. But this isn't helpful. I'm hard coding the database ID, and in a real application, that is not going to fly. So let's use our debug technique again. We're going to say GraphQL debug, and this time, let's debug the root. When we were adding a field to the root query, this root value was empty. When we're adding it to a post, the root value is actually going to be an instance of a post. So we can actually see it has a lot of information here. One of the important pieces of information would be this database ID. So what we can do is say, I'm actually going to change this just for clarity's sake. We'll change that, and we'll say post database ID. And so I'll comment out our debug, and here we go. We can now get a value out of meta for that post. And so I hope what I've explained here helps you understand how to build a plugin to extend WPGraphQL, how to register fields to the schema, how to use arguments on those fields, and how to resolve data from WordPress. Well, that's all for this video. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you learned something about WPGraphQL and how to extend it. I look forward to seeing what you create with this information. Please like and subscribe to this channel so that you can stay updated when I post new videos about WPGraphQL or other technology related to it. I hope you find this information helpful, and I really want to see what y'all build with this, so please share in the comments, share on Twitter, whatever you want. But I'd love to see what kind of plugins and extensions y'all build with this information. Stay tuned for more videos. I've got a lot more topics to cover. Thanks.